All right, so Bitcoin. It's everywhere you look these days, isn't it? I mean, the headlines, the price going up and down, up and
Yeah,
down.
everyone's heard the hype.
Yeah, exactly. But today, we're going beyond the hype in this deep dive. We're trying to really understand these like revolutionary ideas at the heart of it all. What's the real story?
And there's no better place to start than, well, the source itself, Satoshi Nakamoto's white paper.
Oh, yeah.
It's a vision statement for a whole new financial system. This document isn't just like technical mumbo jumbo.
Yeah, and I've taken a look at it, and to be honest, it feels a bit like trying to decipher some kind of secret code. That's why you're here. You're going to break it all down.
Oh,
We're
absolutely.
tackling we're going to tackle something called trustless transactions today,
Yeah,
which kind of already sounds, well, impossible.
right. It's a bit counterintuitive, right?
Yeah.
Especially in the world of finance, we're so used to like banks and big institutions backing up our trust.
Right, right.
But that's exactly what Bitcoin's trying to solve. It's saying, hey, how about we create a system where transactions are secure and trustworthy without needing some big authority figure, you know?
So no banks, no governments calling the shots. That's a big change. Where do we even start with that? Like, how is that even possible?
Well, I think it starts with really rethinking what a transaction even is, right? Think about it. When you send money online using traditional systems,
Right.
you're relying on those middlemen, those banks, to verify everything and basically ensure the money gets where it needs to go.
Okay, so it's like when you send a package, you need someone reliable, like the Postal Service, to make sure it actually gets from point A to point B.
There you go. Exactly. But Bitcoin's like saying, you know what? Let's cut out the middleman completely. Let's send that package directly to the recipient and use some really clever cryptography to make sure it hasn't been tampered with along the way.
Okay, now that's really interesting. How does it do that? How do you create that secure connection directly between, users without someone in the middle? I did see the white paper mention something about digital signatures. Is that what we're talking about?
That's the key. Think of it like a chain of ownership.
Yeah.
Every time a Bitcoin changes hands, the sender digitally signs a record of that transaction. So that links it back to the previous owner.
Okay.
And that chain, it stretches all the way back to the very beginning, to the very first Bitcoin transaction ever made.
Oh, wow. So it's like a permanent traceable history for
Yeah.
every single Bitcoin.
There you go.
No more mystery money floating around out there.
Exactly.
But, okay, I have to ask, with no one in charge, how do you stop someone from, like, copying their Bitcoin and spending it multiple times?
There it is, the $1 million question. Or should I say the $1 billion problem, potentially?
Yeah.
This is what Satoshi Nakamoto called the double spend problem, right? And this is interesting. He says, a common solution is to introduce a trusted central authority.
Which is what we're trying to avoid
Well,
with Bitcoin.
exactly. Instead, he introduces this revolutionary concept, a public ledger called the blockchain. So imagine like a giant digital book that everyone on the Bitcoin network can access.
Okay, so like a giant digital library.
Yeah,
And every Bitcoin transaction is recorded in this book.
precisely. And it's constantly being updated, synchronized across the entire network. So every time a transaction happens, boom, it's broadcast to everyone. And these miners, we'll get into that later,
Right.
but they compete to add it to the blockchain.
So it's like a giant transparent ledger
Exactly.
that everyone has to agree on.
Yeah.
But how do we know that this blockchain is accurate?
Yeah.
Like tamper-proof?
Right.
Couldn't someone just, I don't know, hack into the system and rewrite the ledger to make themselves rich?
That's where things get really, really clever. Satoshi Nakamoto, he was smart, right? He introduced these two really important concepts to address that. Proof of work and the longest chain rule. And he actually writes that the system is secure as long as honest nodes collectively control more CPU power than any cooperating group of attacker nodes.
Okay, hold on a second. Those sound like,
Technical term.
oh yeah, a little intimidating maybe, those
A
terms.
little bit, yeah.
Can you walk me through it?
Absolutely. So imagine the public ledger, that blockchain, as a chain, right? A constantly growing chain of blocks.
Okay.
Now, to add a new block to the chain, miners need to solve these super complex mathematical problems. That's the proof of work.
Okay.
And it takes a ton of computing power and energy to do that.
So like a giant Sudoku puzzle that everyone's trying to solve at the same time.
That's a great analogy, actually. So the first miner to crack the code, they get to add their block to the chain, and they're rewarded with newly minted Bitcoins. And that incentive, that's what drives the entire system.
Interesting. So it's like a competition.
Yeah.
And that's what actually keeps it secure.
That's exactly it. And here's where the longest chain rule comes in. Imagine someone tries to cheat, right? Sneak in a fraudulent transaction or tamper with the blockchain. They would have to redo the proof of work for that block and every single block that comes after it. And that is basically impossible, like virtually impossible, with how much computing power is securing the network.
So as more blocks get added, as time goes on, it gets more secure.
You got it. It's like this fortress where the walls are constantly growing taller and stronger. And it's this ingenious system, right, of
Wow.
these incentives and the cryptography. That's what eliminates the need for that central authority.
That is wild. Okay, it's blowing my mind a little bit. But all this talk about a public ledger, it makes me think about privacy.
Right.
Isn't every Bitcoin transaction like visible to anyone on the network then?
That's a common misconception. It's true that all the transactions are recorded on the blockchain, but Bitcoin's really about pseudonymity rather than complete anonymity.
Pseudonymity. Okay, but
It's a mouthful, I know.
yeah, what's the difference?
So think of it like a username, instead of your real name online.
Okay,
So you have your Bitcoin address, that string of letters and numbers you use for transactions.
right.
That's not directly linked to your actual identity, to your real name.
Okay. So someone looking at the blockchain, they might see a history of all these transactions, but they wouldn't necessarily know who those people were.
Exactly. And to make it even more private, Bitcoin users, they can generate a new key pair, basically a new username for each transaction.
Oh, wow. That's really interesting. So even if someone figured out one of my Bitcoin addresses, they couldn't necessarily see everything.
It makes it much, much harder to track your entire financial activity.
Hmm.
It's important to remember, though, while identities are masked, that transparency on the blockchain, that's a good thing. It's a feature, not a bug. It actually creates this level of accountability that you just don't have in, the traditional financial system.
That's a great point. It's less about trying to hide transactions and more about knowing that there's proof behind them.
Exactly. It's about verifiable proof. You don't need blind faith,
Right.
You can actually see what happened. And this ability to actually trace the history of every single Bitcoin, that's essential for preventing fraud and ensuring the integrity of the whole system.
This all sounds really secure. But are there any vulnerabilities? Could someone, like with enough computing power, just take over the whole network?
That's a question a lot of people have, and it brings us to the idea of a 51% attack, which Satoshi Nakamoto did acknowledge as a theoretical vulnerability.
A 51% attack. Okay, that sounds,
A little scary.
yeah, what is that?
So imagine a single entity or a group, working together. They somehow manage to gain control of more than 50% of the entire network's computing power. More than 50%, yeah?
Okay, so more than half. Like, that just seems
That's a lot, yeah.
like, how is that even? It would take so much, right?
Or a massive amount of resources. I mean, you're talking about needing more computing power than, like, some of the biggest companies in the world combined. It's a scenario that, Satoshi Nakamoto even writes, the probability of a successful attack exponentially decreases as the network grows. So, like, in a practical sense, a 51% attack on Bitcoin, it's incredibly unlikely. It's like trying to rob Fort Knox. Possible. I guess, theoretically, but the logistics, the risks, no one would ever try it.
Okay, well, that's good to know.
Yeah.
But even if that's, not really a likely scenario, it does kind of make you think, what about some of the other challenges? Like, what about the price of Bitcoin, for example? I mean, we've seen it. It jumps around
Vulnerable.
more than a squirrel on a trampoline,
It's true.
So is that sustainable?
Yeah, you've hit on one of the, one of the biggest criticisms of Bitcoin. It's price volatility. Because Bitcoin, it operates independently of any central bank, any government. Its value is completely determined by the market supply and demand. And as we've seen, that can be influenced by, well, pretty much anything. News, speculation, Elon Musk tweeting about his dog,
So it's a little bit like the Wild West out there.
Kind of, yeah. But, this volatility, it's not necessarily a deal breaker. Think about the internet. In the very beginning, things were chaotic, unpredictable. But despite those growing pains, it revolutionized how we live. Bitcoin's like any disruptive technology. It's going to have some ups and downs as it matures.
That's a good point. I think we forget how crazy those early tech days were.
Exactly.
Speaking of growing pains, though, what about scalability? I've heard the network, it can only handle so many transactions per second.
Right.
Is that like a roadblock?
It's definitely a challenge, and the Bitcoin community is working on it because of that proof of work system, which, it's crucial for security. It does mean there's a limit on how fast new transactions can, be added to that blockchain. It's like having a highway, right? It's got a speed limit. Makes it safer, but it can also cause some traffic jams during rush hour.
So finding that right balance between security, keeping things safe, but also making it work on a larger scale.
That's the key. But the great thing is it's open source. Anyone can, help develop it, contribute to it. There are some really, really smart people out there working on solutions right now to try to make it faster, make it more efficient, make it work for everyday use.
That's great. But we can't talk about Bitcoin without mentioning, the elephant in the room, the environmental impact.
Yeah,
All that mining, it takes a lot of energy.
right.
What's your take on that?
It's a valid concern, definitely, and it's a complex issue. It does use a lot of energy, there's no question.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to keep things in perspective. First of all, a lot of the energy used for mining, it's coming from renewable sources. We're talking hydroelectric, geothermal, and more, even solar.
This is not just coal-powered plants churning out Bitcoins.
Not at all. And secondly, I think we need to remember, like, the existing financial system, right?
Right.
Think about all the banks, the data centers, all those institutions. That uses a ton of energy too. And frankly, it often comes from, less sustainable sources.
Right. It's like comparing, a horse and buggy to a Tesla. It's not always a simple comparison.
There you go. Exactly. When we assess Bitcoin's environmental impact, we need to think about the system that is trying to replace, right? Not just some ideal alternative. And a lot of people don't realize this, but there are people working on making it even more energy efficient.
Oh, wow, that's good. That's good to hear. Okay, so we covered a lot of ground today, from, the genius behind these trustless transactions to some of um, the challenges, the criticisms, that Bitcoin is facing. As we kind of wrap up this deep dive, what's the one thing you really want listeners to take away from all this?
That Bitcoin, it's more than just like a new type of money, It's a different way of looking at trust, at transactions. It's about taking these really powerful tools like cryptography, this idea of
Yeah.
decentralized networks, to make a financial system that's more transparent, more secure, more accessible to everyone. And yeah, it's got its challenges, like any really revolutionary technology, but its impact, it's undeniable.
That's a great point. This has been really, really eye-opening. I'll be honest, I was a bit intimidated by this whole Bitcoin thing, but you've really broken it down in a way that's easy to understand, and honestly, it's actually pretty exciting. To our listeners, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep this in mind. Bitcoin might just be the start of something much, much bigger than just a new type of money. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Bitcoin.